I will recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Thank you all so much for your expertise and your passion about this important issue. I remember back in 2014, I was able to sit down with Mr. Wood, and we spent a pretty long afternoon, I think, identifying a lot of the problems, and I'm sorry to say that everything you said came true and that all the problems that you identified were dead on, but I appreciate that you're here to help us address that. I was just out at the Consumer Technology Conference earlier this week, and so we're seeing a lot of the new things that are in practice, and certainly the concept of innovate or die is very much a reality here. So I was wondering if, because I think you've all addressed a little bit, but how do existing maybe government contracting provisions impact the ability for the public sector to be agile and to be able to do what you do in the private sector? And how can we, I know this is a little bit out of our jurisdiction in terms of government contracting, but sort of in identifying the problem and how we can address it. We have the standards, we have the practices, we know, need to be more risk management based instead of just the checklist. How can we all, get those type of policies in the government that are as agile as what you're dealing with in the private sector? So, if you want to start, John.
One suggestion I would have is that I think it would be very helpful for the government to move more towards a best value approach to government contracting versus a lowest price technically acceptable approach. The same individuals that we put on an assignment with the government, often we will receive a much higher rate for those individuals when we're working commercially, because commercial companies tend to value the kind of capabilities that our security professionals have. And when I say much higher, often it's 200 to 300% higher. And I think at the end of the day, that's a really big issue that the government needs to at least address, because otherwise you tend to get what you pay for.
Yes, Mr. Clinton.
Sorry. I agree completely with Mr. Wood, and I think this speaks to part of the education issue that I was speaking to. We need to have a better understanding of the breadth of cybersecurity. What you're talking about, Madam Chairman, is frankly not an IT problem. It is an economic problem. That's what cybersecurity is. It is not an IT problem. It is an economic problem. And we need to find a way to move away from, as Mr. Wood said, lowest cost items, particularly in the federal space. We have examples where federal agencies are buying equipment off eBay from non-secure suppliers because it's lower in cost. And while we appreciate the tension and the need for economy in these times, we have to understand that there is a direct trade-off between economy and security. And we're just going to have to come to grips with that, and we haven't. I think if we could educate the federal leadership in the way we're educating corporate boards, where, by the way, we had exactly the same problem a few years ago, we might be able to get a better appreciation of the interplay between the economics of cybersecurity and the technology of cybersecurity. The real problem that you're speaking to, in my opinion, mostly comes in the smaller business elements of cybersecurity. If you're going to deal with, for example, the major defense contractors, frankly, you compensate them perfectly well, and they have pretty good cybersecurity. But because of the procurement system, they are required, essentially, to farm out a lot of the procurement to smaller firms across the country and congressional districts. And those smaller firms do not have the economies of scale to meet the cybersecurity standards that the primes have. We have to find a way to provide incentives for those smaller companies to come up to grade, because it is not economic from their business point of view in order to do that. Now, we think that there are a number of suggestions that we've made, and I referred to in my oral statement and in that trade association paper, that could talk about how we can better incentivize the smaller companies so that we can get them up closer to where the majors are. And if we can do that, we can achieve our goal, which is a cyber-secure system as opposed to cyber-secure entities.
Right. Mr. Schneider.
I think another thing, this isn't directly a contract issue, is to use the tools that they've already purchased. I think one thing we see a lot in both the private sector and in the public sector is the acquisition of technologies that then aren't even configured properly and used properly. So a lot of the investment that happens both within private organizations as well as with public organizations is to take the technology purchases and make sure that you have the right human capital and the right best practices to deploy those properly. And I mean, the most cost-effective thing you can do is use the money that you've already spent more wisely. So I think that's one key that we see as well.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Casado.
Yeah, and just kind of quickly more on a positive note, I think, so I'm kind of a personal success story of this. So when I graduated with my PhD, I was thinking about being a professor, and instead I started working with the intelligence community, who decided to fund a startup that we were doing, and they were great to work with early on. And kind of to Congressman Bayer's point, I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from the government, and that turned into kind of one of the largest tech sector acquisitions in the private sector ever, and a huge security initiative. So I think more working with the startup ecosystem. I mean, I'm a Silicon Valley guy, but more working with the startup ecosystem, funding that, allowing us access to the way that you think about the security technology, I think will hugely help innovation.
Thank you, and I want to particularly note so I think Mr. Wood, you call it the fifth, our fifth war-fighting command is cyber here. I'm running out of my time, but if we can get, and Mr. Clinton, the numbers and the comparison between private sector and the public sector and what we're spending and sort of the quality, I think that's a very helpful contrast in understanding this is part of our defense system, and certainly as we've seen social media being used in the terrorism area and all of those. So I appreciate you putting a real emphasis on that. Thank you. And I'll now recognize Ms.